one of Australia's most famous sort of premiers. Fire, flood, tempest, drought, pestilence and other things mould one's character. It's become such an important part of the idea of what makes Australians unique. This idea that this harsh land is what has actually forged our identity. And it's still with us today. It's not just Henry Holt, he was a very conservative man. Just have a look at someone like Tim Flannery. Australian, we've come across Tim Flannery so far, most of you will have heard of him. But this is what he wrote. Australians have been shaped in a profound way, in a positive way, by the environment. We are so fortunate that the Australian environment, through its poverty, has forced upon us an ethos of social obligation, of mateship. Australian mateship is a realisation that we either stand together in this environment or fall alone. Again, you can just see that coming through. And you can see it in the way that Andrew Campbell was talking about his descendants and in sort of Western Victoria, when he was talking about his identity. He started off his talk by giving us a sort of by showing us a picture of his farm, making him what he is. Now, this bush myth has been questioned by people like Jeff Page by pointing out that it leaves a lot of people out. It not only leaves out Australian Aborigines, it also, as Henry Lawson once pointed out, it also leaves out woman, the drover's wife. It also is very much a masculinist identity for Australia. And there are people such as Germaine Greer who believe that we should leave this type of mythology alone. And in fact, she says we don't love the country, we actually hate it. We hate this country because we cannot allow ourselves to love it. We know in our heart's core that it is not ours. What Germaine Greer is trying to do here is remind us that we dispossessed a people in order to take this land. So I suppose to sum up though, whether or not we agree with Greer or not, and we've got to remember that whether or not we agree with mythologizing, it is an important aspect of how Australians see themselves and how they like to think about themselves when they socially interact. But Marilyn Lane, I think, sort of sums up what I've been trying to say so far when she says, through the bush myth, the land thus acquired a spiritual significance for non-Aboriginal as well as Aboriginal Australians. And I think it's important to realise that all cultures have a spiritual attachment to the land. We just don't think about it as spiritual because we see ourselves as being so scientific and rationalities. One of the central fantasies of nationalist writing in Australia has been that the national character was born in the bush. So that's the first point I want to make when I'm trying to look at this idea. Why do people see landscapes in different ways? And the answer here, in the first part of my talk, is because cultures always require some spiritual attachment to land. And they create these stories which give themselves an attachment to that land. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. But the second one is something which has been more controversial. Not that that hasn't been controversial, the notion of the Australian national origins, but it's come up in almost all of our panels so far, and you'll hear it tomorrow. We've got Peter MacDonald tomorrow, is that right? So you'll come across this tomorrow when we look at the issue of population. But I want to give another more contemporary example of how and why people see landscapes in different ways. And I want to look at the way, I want to look at a way in which we can try to understand contemporary conflict over environmental issues. Because this is directly related to all of our issues on sustainability and the different ways of understanding what sustainability means and the sort of the future of human ecological interaction. Now, I suppose the main way that we have come to see social ecological interaction has been a trade-off, okay, between economic growth and environmental quality. So what we have here is that Environmental. If you think back to my first lecture when I was looking at that moral imperative of progress, the dominant way white Australians have tended to view the environment is to see environmental deterioration as the price for progress. We have to have progress, and therefore that means that environmental quality might have been less than it would have otherwise been. So the progress suggests that we should aim for M, high economic growth, even if it means that we trade off environmental quality. Conservationists, on the other hand, have always wanted to sort of have high environmental quality, even if that means less economic growth. So if you listened last week to Richard Dennis, he was arguing that we should aim for a place closer to C rather than M. But it's always, what has tended to always happen for most of colonial Australian history and post-colonial history is that we've got this trade-off between economic growth and environmental quality. And of course, people who want to be at point M and people who want to be at point C place different emphases on the need for economic growth or environmental quality. Now, Stephen Cotgrove, an environmentalist of the 80s, labelled these two positions the catastrophists and the cornucopians. And what I want to do is I want to show you how a lot of what we've been looking at so far in the course and what you might be able to look at in some of the panel discussions that we're going to come across is actually sort of look at these from the different perspectives of whether or not they're cornucopian or catastrophist. So the catastrophists are people who argue that if we have high economic growth, we're going to destroy the planet and we need to increase environmental quality. So catastrophists go for point C, while the cornucopians tend to want point M. They argue that economic growth will solve all of our problems. So let's have a look at what these people are. Let's have a look at how we can explain them. Let's have a look at the catastrophists, first of all. The catastrophists, this can be described, these are two extreme positions, and of course you'll find people, they're two opposite ends of a spectrum, and so I'm not suggesting that everyone is either on one or the other, but this is a useful way of trying to gauge where people might stand in the debates that you've been looking at so far. But the catastrophists would be those who stress the dangers of environmental destruction and the unsustainability of our existing patterns of economic growth. So this lovely cartoon up here suggests that we're eating away at our natural capital, and we're eating away at our children's future. And of course the lovely thing about it is it's also suggesting that time is running out. So that's the sort of the basis of the catastrophists' sort of argument. One person who you'll have come across so far who would be regarded as a catastrophist would be Ian Lowe. When he has contemplated our survival, he's written quite a few famous essays over the past few years, including a recent quarterly essay where he's arguing against nuclear energy. But when he's contemplating our survival on this planet over the next century, he laments that the human race, or at least Western civilization, shows no sign at the moment of even recognising the scale of the environmental problem that we face, let alone to developing solutions. And he points out the 5 key problems that we have got to face properly. The first is the whole notion of resource depletion, which we've come across so far. According to Lowe, the key resources which our industrialised society depend, namely oil, are going to run out very soon. You've heard of the concept of peak oil and debates about whether or not we're there at the moment. And so he's arguing that we've got to fundamentally change the basis of our energy use if we're going to survive, if our culture is going to survive. Yet he points out that there seems to be no serious move towards alternative and renewable energy sources, such as solar or wind or wave or geothermal or tidal sort of energy, which was also a point which Andrew Campbell made as well.
tidal energy was like massive coastal ecosystem damage?
Well,